When the valley froze solid and the biting winds howled, one mountain man's ingenious creation stood defiant against the elements. His cabin, built with a blend of stone and timber, became an unbreakable fortress in the face of winter's fury, a testament to the raw will of survival. Before we dive into the story of this incredible cabin, drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. And if you love these survival stories, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next is even more astonishing than what you've just heard. The winter had come early that year, and the mountain valley, a vast expanse of white, seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the pale sky. The wind swept over the land with a ferocity only the wilderness could muster, biting through the clothes of even the hardiest of men. In this unforgiving place, where the air held a sharpness that could freeze the breath in your chest, one trapper found himself fighting not just the landscape but the very cabin he had built to protect himself. Samuel Hale had spent years in these mountains, learning every creak and groan of his cabin as it battled the elements. He had seen winters harsher than most, but nothing had prepared him for the brutal assault of this particular storm. The snow piled higher with each passing hour, and the winds seemed intent on ripping the very roof from the walls. Inside his cabin, Samuel could feel the cold seeping in, a draft that had found its way into every crack and crevice. The fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, its warmth struggling to push back the cold. Samuel wrapped himself tightly in his fur-lined cloak, but even that couldn't chase away the chill that had taken root deep in his bones. He'd built this cabin with pride, believing it would keep him safe through any storm. The logs were sturdy, the roof thick with layers of snow and pine boughs, but as the temperature dropped and the wind howled louder, Samuel realized the truth. His cabin was not the sanctuary he had hoped for. It was not enough to survive the fury of the wilderness. He needed more. He needed something that would hold the heat he desperately needed to survive the night. His mind raced back to the days when he had first built the cabin, remembering how he had scoured the land for the best materials, strong logs for the frame, thick stone for the foundation. But now, standing alone in the cold, the thought of a better solution gnawed at him. He knew the land, the weather, and the dangers of the valley better than anyone, but he had overlooked one critical element: the fight against the cold. The stone foundation, while solid, had not been enough to combat the intense freeze that had overtaken the land. The logs that made up the walls were solid, but gaps between them, though small, allowed the cold air to slip through like a silent thief. Samuel stared out through the frosted window, watching the storm rage outside. The world beyond was silent, save for the wind's howl, and he could feel the isolation settling deep within his chest. It was just him, the cold, and the mountain that seemed determined to swallow him whole. With a long, weary sigh, Samuel turned back to the hearth. The fire crackled again, the last embers glowing faintly in the center. He would need to act fast, or this winter would be the last he would ever spend in the wilderness. His hands gripped the edges of the worn table in front of him, his thoughts already moving toward a solution. The stone-skirted cabin he had heard of in old tales, the kind that could survive the harshest conditions, might just be the answer. But to build such a thing, he would need more than just logs and stones. He would need a deeper understanding of construction, a combination of old knowledge and new ideas that could defy the cold. The storm had settled into a steady flurry, coating the world in a thick layer of snow that erased all signs of life. The valley, once a place of quiet beauty, now seemed like a desolate wasteland, its harsh contours hidden beneath the endless white. Even the trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow, as though they too had given up their fight against the winter's wrath. Samuel's cabin stood alone in the middle of this vast white desert. The chimney's thin plume of smoke was the only sign of life in the otherwise barren landscape. He had long since learned to read the tracks of animals, the position of the sun, and the subtle shifts in the wind, but now He was fighting an enemy that didn't leave tracks, one that couldn't be tracked or reasoned with. The cold was an invisible, relentless force that crept into his bones and threatened to strip the life from him. He paced the cabin restlessly, feeling the oppressive weight of the storm outside pressing in on him. The small fire in the hearth flickered weakly, and he tried to push the chill back with another handful of dry kindling. The stone walls, while a solid defense against the elements, were cold to the touch. The warmth from the fire couldn't seem to reach beyond the immediate vicinity, leaving the rest of the cabin to suffer under the bite of the valley's frozen breath. Samuel was no stranger to hardship, but the cold that year felt different. It wasn't just the drop in temperature, it was the way it seemed to settle in, slowly creeping through the cracks, embedding itself deep in his cabin. The wind howled outside like a wolf in the night, but inside it was worse. The silence of the cold was deafening. It was a silence that spoke louder than any storm, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the mountains. Samuel's mind wandered as he gazed out the small window, watching the snowflakes dance in the gusts of wind. He thought back to his early days in the mountains, to when he had first come here, seeking freedom, and the solitude that the wilderness promised. He had survived long enough to learn its ways, to understand its rhythms and its moods. But the mountain had never been kind. It had taken much from him already, and it seemed intent on taking more. He had lost a partner to the wilds, and now the mountain was threatening to claim him as well. It wasn't just the grizzly bears, the unpredictable storms, or the long winters that wore down the mountain men. It was the slow, quiet erosion of spirit, the constant battle with nature that wore away at the soul. And now Samuel was facing the most insidious foe of all, the cold that seemed determined to claim everything he had worked for. His thoughts returned to the cabin he had built, the one that had once felt like a fortress. The design was simple, functional, a log frame with a stone foundation to keep it secure. But now, standing inside, Samuel could feel the inefficiency of his creation. It wasn't enough, not now, not when the world outside was turning to ice. He could feel the frost creeping along the edges of the cabin, and it gnawed at him, a constant reminder that his survival depended on more than just strength or endurance. With a heavy heart, Samuel turned away from the window and approached the table where he had been working. The plans he had sketched out months ago seemed like childish dreams now, but they were all he had. He had to finish what he had started. He had to build the cabin that could stand against the forces of nature and keep the warmth inside where it belonged. The next few days would be critical. If he didn't act soon, the cold would take everything. The wind howled through the trees, its mournful cry piercing the silence of the valley. Samuel sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames as they cast long, trembling shadows on the stone walls of his cabin. The warmth from the fire was a fleeting comfort, fading quickly as the wind howled louder, rattling the wooden walls. Outside, the storm had intensified, and Samuel could hear the snow beginning to accumulate in heavy drifts. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The fire crackled, but its warmth barely reached the far corners of the room. The cold had crept in again, through the cracks in the walls, around the window frames, beneath the door. Samuel felt it, a persistent chill that gnawed at him from the inside, seeping into his bones. It was relentless, the cold creeping under his skin and sinking deep into his flesh. He had tried everything to make the cabin livable, adding more fuel to the fire, covering the windows with blankets, sealing the gaps with whatever he could find. But it was never enough. The cold always found its way in. He had built the cabin for protection, but it had failed him. What had once been a refuge now felt like a prison. A soft groan escaped his lips as he stood and moved toward the door, his fur-lined boots crunching on the floor. The wind was deafening now, and he could feel the bitter cold seeping into the room, biting at his skin. Samuel opened the door just a crack, and the icy blast of wind hit him like a wall. He stepped out onto the snow-covered ground, the cold immediately sinking into his legs, making every movement feel like a struggle. The valley stretched out before him, blanketed in a layer of white. The trees were bowed under the weight of the snow, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and ice. Samuel stood there, watching the storm rage around him. His breath came in short, heavy bursts, visible in the freezing air. The harsh winds made it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him, but in the distance he could make out the vague outline of his cabin, barely visible through the haze of snow. He thought back to his partner John and the winters they had spent together in this very place. John had been the first to realize the dangers of the cold. He had warned Samuel that their shelter wasn't enough, but Samuel had been too proud, too confident in the cabin's design. He had dismissed the concerns, believing that his skills and knowledge would keep him safe. But now, as the cold pressed in on him, Samuel realized how wrong he had been. The cold was not something you could simply endure. It was a force that could break you if you weren't careful. He closed the door and locked it behind him, the sound of the latch echoing in the stillness. The cabin was still, but the cold was a constant presence, reminding him of his failure. Samuel sank back into his chair, staring into the fire. He had to face the truth. He needed to do more. The cabin wasn't enough to protect him from the forces of nature. He needed to build something better, something that would stand against the cold and give him the warmth he needed to survive. But where would he begin? Samuel sat at his table, staring down at the rough sketches he had made earlier. The candlelight flickered weakly in the small room, casting an eerie glow over the worn pages. He had drawn the same design over and over again, each version just slightly different, but none of them felt right. The stone-skirted cabin was his only hope now. His obsession had become a matter of life and death. But Samuel had never been an architect, not in the formal sense. He was a trapper, a man of the wilderness, not a builder. He had learned carpentry from his father, but he had never attempted anything on the scale of what he envisioned. The plan seemed simple enough, a cabin reinforced with stones, a foundation that would hold the weight of the winter's fury. But as he studied the sketches, doubt crept in. Would it be enough? Could he truly build something that would withstand the cold, the wind, and the weight of the snow? He sat back, rubbing his eyes with one hand, the other still gripping the pencil. His thoughts drifted to the valley outside, to the storm still raging against the walls of his cabin. He could hear the wind whistling through the cracks, the distant howl of wolves calling out in the night. There was a time when he would have welcomed the harshness of the wilderness, when the challenges of the land were just another part of his survival. But now, as the cold pressed against him from all sides, it felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Samuel knew that if he didn't do something soon, he wouldn't survive the winter. The fire was not enough to keep him warm. The cabin was not enough to protect him. But in his desperation, he began to see the solution. The cold that had infiltrated his home was not an enemy he could simply fight. It was something that needed to be outsmarted, something he could trap and contain. He set down his pencil and stood up, pacing back and forth across the room. His breath clouded in the air as the fire burned low. He could feel his heart racing, his mind working faster than his body could keep up. The stone-skirted cabin, it wasn't just a place to live. It was a fortress, a way to reclaim control over the elements. He needed to insulate the walls, strengthen the foundation, reinforce every part of the structure. He had to trap the heat inside, keep the cold at bay, and create a barrier between himself and the wilderness outside. The stone would be key, Samuel realized, not just for the foundation, but for the walls. He could build up the lower half of the cabin with stone, creating a skirt that would not only provide additional insulation, but also act as a natural barrier against the wind. The stone would hold the heat in, trapping it inside the cabin like a furnace. It was a radical idea, something that had never been done before in these parts. But desperation had a way of sparking creativity, and Samuel's mind was alight with possibilities. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. If he wanted to survive, he would have to push beyond the boundaries of what he thought was possible. He would have to reinvent his cabin from the ground up. With a renewed sense of purpose, Samuel grabbed his coat and stepped into the snow. The storm was still raging, but he didn't care. He had a plan now. The cold might have its hold on the land, but Samuel Hale was about to fight back. And this time, he would win. The morning light barely pierced the thick, swirling snowstorm, casting a muted gray hue over the land. Samuel stood at the edge of his cabin, his breath visible in the bitter air as he surveyed the work ahead of him. His hands, raw from the cold, gripped the handle of his axe, the metal gleaming in the weak sunlight. Today the real work would begin, the foundation of his new shelter, the stone-skirted cabin. The snow beneath his feet had drifted in deep, icy layers, but he would have to dig through it to uncover the ground beneath. His heart beat heavily in his chest as he imagined the task ahead. He had always considered himself a practical man, focused on survival, but now he had to think beyond the basics. This project was about ingenuity, about creating something that could outlast the fury of the wilderness. Samuel moved swiftly, cutting through the snow with determined strokes, clearing the ground around the cabin's perimeter. He knew that the success of his cabin depended on the foundation. If he built it wrong, all the stone and timber in the world wouldn't matter. The cabin would sink, the stone would shift, and he would be right back where he started, trapped in the cold. His plan was simple in concept, a shallow trench around the cabin filled with stones that would help support the structure, keep it level, and provide a solid base to distribute the weight of the cabin. It wasn't just about holding up the walls, it was about reinforcing the entire structure against the relentless pressure of the snow and the weight of time. As he dug deeper, the cold started to creep through his thick woolen clothes, seeping into his skin. Samuel didn't stop. The trench was coming together, and though it was hard work, the satisfaction of seeing his plan take shape fueled him. He would get this right. He had to. It took hours, but by the time the first light of dusk began to fall, Samuel had cleared the trench. He stepped back, surveying the work. The trench was shallow but wide enough to allow for a strong, stable foundation. He could already see the vision taking form, the stone skirt he had planned to encircle the cabin, keeping the cold at bay and reinforcing the walls. The stone was a challenge to find in these parts, but Samuel had discovered a ridge of limestone a few miles away, where the snow had cleared enough to reveal the rocky outcrop beneath. Each stone he carried back felt like a small victory, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The work was exhausting, but Samuel was fueled by a quiet determination. He had no choice but to succeed. By nightfall, Samuel had arranged the first few layers of stone in the trench. The stones clicked together with a satisfying rhythm, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of warmth in his chest. He wasn't just building a cabin anymore, he was building his future. The cold would come, but it would not claim him. The following days blurred together as Samuel continued his work, driven by the thought of survival. The trench was now lined with stone, sturdy and firm beneath the weight of the snow. The foundation was ready, and it was time to move on to the next phase, building the walls. The stone skirt around the base was a bold idea, something that no one had attempted before, and Samuel knew he had to get the construction just right. It wasn't just about aesthetics or practicality, it was about keeping himself safe. The stone would provide a natural buffer against the elements, but he needed the rest of the cabin to support that design. The logs for the walls had to be hand-picked, carefully chosen to provide the right balance of strength and insulation. Samuel went into the forest with his axe, selecting each tree with precision. The trunks had to be straight, free of knots and warping. Each log would be stripped of its bark to ensure a better fit, a tighter seal between the logs. As he worked, his breath visible in the frigid air, Samuel could feel the weight of each choice. If he chose poorly, the entire structure would fail. He wasn't just building for today, he was building for the future. As he chopped through the trees, Samuel's mind raced with thoughts of the winter ahead. He knew that once the structure was built, the real challenge would begin. The cold would test his work just as it had tested him over the years. But there was something about this new project, this stone-skirted cabin, that felt different. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of control. The wilderness had taken so much from him, but now he was fighting back. After days of cutting, hauling, and preparing, the logs were ready. Samuel began the painstaking process of stacking them, working from the stone foundation upwards. The logs interlocked with precision, their edges fitting together tightly. As he built, Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction. The stone skirt was solid, and the logs were forming a strong, resilient structure. The walls rose steadily, and with each log placed, Samuel's confidence grew. It was slow work. There was no rushing the process, no shortcuts. Every log had to be measured, shaped, and fitted with care. As the walls began to take shape, Samuel noticed something that filled him with pride. The cabin was beginning to take on a form that was entirely his own. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a reflection of his will to survive, his determination to conquer the land that had tried to claim him. By the end of the week, the first layer of walls was complete. Samuel stepped back and wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the cold. The cabin was strong. The stone skirt was in place and the walls were solid. There was still much to do, roofing, windows, and a door. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Samuel felt a flicker of hope. The wilderness might be harsh, but he wasn't backing down. He would finish this cabin, and it would stand strong against the coming storms. The days had grown shorter, and the winds stronger as the storm continued its siege on the valley. Samuel had completed the stone skirt and the lower walls, but now the real challenge lay ahead, the roof. The snow had piled higher with each passing day, and the bitter cold was settling in deep. Samuel had always known that the roof would be the most critical part of the cabin's defense against the winter. If he didn't get it right, all the work on the walls and foundation would be for nothing. Samuel surveyed the cabin, now partially enclosed by its stone walls, and began to gather the materials for the roof. He had already chosen a sturdy frame of logs, thick and strong, but it wasn't just the structure that mattered. It was how he would cover it. The usual method of roofing with bark or sod was far too vulnerable, too easily penetrable by the snow and rain that plagued these mountains. He needed something that would withstand both the weight of snow and the relentless winds. He had learned from the few settlers in the area that layering was key. The roofs of their cabins had often collapsed under the weight of snow, unable to support the heavy burden. But Samuel had a plan. He would build a roof that could bear the weight of the heaviest storm. A roof that would keep the warmth inside and protect him from the harshest elements. The first layer of his roof was simple. Thick, sturdy logs that would form the framework, much like the beams of a barn. The logs were selected with care, notched at the edges to create a seamless fit. Samuel had learned long ago that the key to good construction was not rushing. Each piece needed to be shaped with precision. As he worked, his hands numbed by the cold, Samuel could feel the weight of the project on his shoulders. Every decision, every piece of wood could mean the difference between survival and failure. The next layer was where Samuel's ingenuity came into play. He had spent hours researching the local plants and trees, finding the thickest, most insulative materials to layer beneath the logs. Birch bark would form the next layer. He'd seen its effectiveness as an insulator before, flexible, waterproof, and strong. But he knew it needed something more, something that would hold it all together and reinforce the structure. So Samuel devised a solution using his clay and horsehair resin mixture. The same substance that had sealed the walls of his cabin would now hold the roof together. He spread the clay over the birch bark, layering it in thick, even sections. As the material dried, it hardened into a durable, waterproof membrane, perfect for holding back the snow and rain. The final layer, a thick sheet of sod, would sit atop it all, creating a natural barrier against the cold. The earth would provide insulation, while the layers beneath it would keep the snow from settling into the roof. By the time he finished, the roof was a fortress of its own. The weight of the snow would be distributed across the multiple layers, each one working in tandem to prevent collapse. Samuel stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow, even in the cold. The cabin was beginning to take shape, a structure that would stand against anything the wilderness could throw at it. He was exhausted, his body aching from days of hard labor, but the roof was finally in place. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin there was a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had built something that would survive the winter, something that would keep him warm and safe through the coldest nights. The next few days were a blur of preparation, as Samuel worked tirelessly to complete the final touches on his cabin. With the roof secured, there were only a few remaining tasks: sealing up the door, finishing the window coverings, and preparing the interior for the long nights ahead. He had built the walls, foundation, and roof with precision, but now the cabin would face its greatest trial, the unforgiving winter storm. It was the first true test of his work. The air had become colder, the winds fiercer, and the snow fell in thick, suffocating layers. The storm had come in full force, a blizzard that could paralyze the valley for days. As the wind howled outside, Samuel could feel the pressure of his creation. This was it, the moment where his work would either save him or fail him. He stepped inside the cabin, feeling the cold rush in with every movement. The door was solid and the walls were strong, but the test would be in how well the heat held up. He had left small gaps in the walls for ventilation, but the cold was already creeping into the cabin. Samuel stoked the fire and stood by the hearth, watching as the flames flickered and crackled. The warmth was slow to spread, but it was there, a steady rise of heat filling the room, even as the winds raged outside. As the hours passed, Samuel continued to monitor the fire, checking the walls and the roof for any signs of weakness. He knew that if the fire couldn't hold its heat, the cold would seep in and spread like an infection. He had to keep the warmth inside at all costs. He was familiar with the dangers of hypothermia, of how a person could freeze to death in just a few hours if the conditions were bad enough. He had seen men die from exposure in the wilderness, and he wouldn't let that be his fate. The storm outside intensified, and the wind began to howl with a viciousness that made the walls tremble. Snow piled high against the cabin, and the temperature plummeted even further. But inside, it was different. The warmth from the fire clung to the stone walls, rising up into the logs above. The clay and horsehair mixture had worked. It held the heat in, trapping it inside the cabin. The roof, thick with layers of bark, clay, and sod, kept the cold at bay, despite the howling winds. By the time the storm subsided, several days later, Samuel knew that his cabin had passed the test. It wasn't just the fire that had kept him warm, it was the structure itself, designed with care, reinforced with ingenuity, and crafted with an obsessive attention to detail. The stone skirt had held, the logs had stayed tight, and the roof had borne the weight of the storm without giving way. Samuel sat in the warmth of his cabin, staring out the window at the snow-covered valley. The storm had passed, but he knew there would be more to come. The wilderness was unforgiving, and the cold would always be there, waiting. But now he had a shelter that could withstand it. His creation had kept him alive through the harshest winter storm he had ever faced. The cold might still come for him, but Samuel Hale had built something stronger than the storm. The mountain had tested him, but he had fought back with his mind, his hands, and his will to survive. And in the end, he had won. The storm continued to rage for days, a relentless assault on Samuel's small corner of the world. The wind howled outside, whipping the snow into a blinding fury. But inside his cabin, warmth held firm. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its heat radiating through the stone walls and thick roof. Samuel, exhausted but determined, monitored the cabin's interior, checking every crack for leaks. It was a slow test of resilience. Every gust of wind outside was matched by the quiet hum of his cabin's defense, solid walls, carefully constructed layers of roof, and the stone skirt working as planned. As the days wore on, the temperature outside dropped further, but Samuel never felt the cold clawing at him. His cabin was holding strong. When the storm finally passed, the valley was buried under feet of snow. But inside, Samuel was safe. His fire was still warm, and the walls held the heat as they should. The wilderness had thrown its worst at him, but his work had paid off. The cabin was a fortress. He had survived. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in sheets, but Samuel remained in his cabin, untouched by the harsh winter. The storm had tested him, but he had succeeded. His stone-skirted cabin stood firm, a testament to his ingenuity and determination. The valley outside began to thaw, but inside Samuel knew he had built something that would last. His work had not only protected him, it would now protect anyone who sought shelter in this rugged land. His cabin became more than a home. It was a legacy of survival. The lessons learned from the winter had been turned into a structure that could withstand anything. Years later, travelers would stumble upon his cabin, unaware of the hands that built it. Yet the mountain men who came through would recognize the strength of the walls and the warmth inside. Samuel's legacy lived on, not in stories told by the fire, but in the walls he had crafted, enduring long after his time in the wilderness had passed.